Now let's turn to talk some about the nature of capital with respect to time. Now here it's worth observing that capital is really just any produced factor of production. That is, it is something we use to produce something else that itself had to be produced at some point in time. So something as simple as, say, any machinery that you would use in the productive process. We know machinery does not just exist in nature, it has to be produced by mankind, and as humanity produces this machinery, it is something that is produced, but at the same time it is not the end result. The end result is something that we use that machine to produce. Okay, so it is a produced factor of production. Now, as such, this suggests there is a temporal separation between the capital purchase, or the capital production, and the sale of the product. Right? We know that it takes a certain amount of time. Time does pass between when we start producing something and when we end up producing something, or when we buy all the materials that we need to make something and when that thing actually gets made and sold. That separation in time suggests that time may actually matter as part of this process. And so this temporal separation suggests that the interest rate then is going to matter. Now, one way we can get a handle around this is by realizing that if I have a certain amount of resources right now, I really have a couple choices what I can do with them. Right? Really two options. One is to invest in capital, that is to open a business, right? Pour my money into paying for all of the labor that I need to get the business off the ground, all the machinery that I need, all the materials that I need, all of these things. I can make those investments. Or I can take that money that I have and I can lend it out at interest. Right? Either of these is an option. Now, logically speaking, these two should look equally attractive to me, which means that the rate of return on my capital should be tied to the interest rate that I can get if I lend money out at interest. This actually results from what we call the present value equation. The present value equation takes the future value that comes from an investment, the time lapsed between when we make the investment and when it pays off, and the level of interest rates that we can earn, and uses these to find the present value of a particular investment. And here's the formula. The present value is equal to, take that future value, divide by 1 plus the interest rate, take that 1 plus the interest rate to the nth power, where n is the number of periods that pass before you get that future value. So it really just describes how much we should pay for an investment, or should be willing to pay for an investment, that pays whatever that future value is in n periods, when the per period interest rate is whatever the interest rate happens to be. So for example, here would be a case where the future value is $110. So I believe I'm going to end up with a product that's worth $110. And say that right now interest rates are 10% per year. And I believe that I'm going to get that $110 in 1 year, so 1 year from now. Now here I'm ignoring any kind of quarterly payments or what have you, so if you've taken finance classes, set that aside. We'll just say annual interest rates, you're paid annually. Use that to try to find what the present value is. After you've done the math, you'll find the present value is $100, which suggests you should be willing to take $100 and put it into this investment. Now, to show that this is a sensible thing, we can really think about how much you would earn in each of these investments. If I take $100 and I put it into this capital that gives me a product worth $110 at the end, I've made $10 on my $100 investment, or 10%. Well, the other option, of course, was taking my $100, sticking it in the bank, earning 10% interest. It's exactly the same, right? So I should be willing to pay up to $100 to start this investment. If I can get it for anything less than that, that's a very good deal. I certainly want to hop on it. If I have to pay, say, $105 for this investment, it's not worth it. It's going to pay me less than the interest rate that I could earn elsewhere. So, what's the story behind this present value equation? I'm not talking about who came up with it and that kind of thing, but what's the story the equation tells? Right? We'll find it's very sensible. On the one hand, the higher the future value is, that is, the higher the value of the product we expect, the more valuable the present value is going to be, or the more valuable the capital is going to be. So if I expect to have a really valuable product at the end of the day, I'm going to be willing to pay a lot for the capital right now. It also suggests that the higher the interest rate is, the lower the present value is going to be. Now remember, the interest rate here is really telling us what's the value of the other alternatives, right, of the other things that I can do with my money. If there's a high interest rate, that means that I can earn a lot by lending my money out to other people, or the alternatives look really good. That being the case, I'm not going to be as willing to invest in capital. That's going to push down the value of capital. a higher n, or a higher number of periods, also suggests that there would be a lower present value. Here, this is really just time preference at work, right? The longer the time between when I invest and when I get my money back out, right, the less I'm going to value that particular capital, because I have time preference. I'd rather get things sooner. If I have to wait a really long time, then I'm not going to put as much value on that thing. Now it ends up that we can use the present value equation to uncover a relationship between the length of the production processes that we choose and the level of interest. So look at this. Here are what I have. I have two investments, right? Investment number 1 and investment number 2. Investment 1 pays off a little bit sooner. It pays you in 1 year rather than 2, but the future value is a bit lower. So you get $110 of product with investment 1, while you get $115 of product with investment 2. Now what we see here, I calculated the present values in two different interest rate regimes. In the first table, the interest rate was set at 1%. In that case, we can compare the present values of these two different investments, and we find out that investment 2 is actually the more valuable one. I would rather invest in investment 2 than in investment 1. But another way, the present value of investment 2 is higher than investment 1. I should be willing to pay more to do it. Now that being the case, we can imagine it is often possible for us to take the same materials and to do different things with them, right? So I might possibly throw these materials together into something that's not very valuable, but I can do it quickly. Or I might throw them together more carefully and produce something that's higher quality and therefore higher value, but it's going to take more time to do it. Right? So what this is really telling us is that in the presence of low interest rates, I'm more likely to choose that second option of taking my time, getting a really high value product. Now the reason is that the low interest rate really indicates that time preference is very low in society. That is, people are very willing to wait for things. That being the case, it makes perfect sense that I should in fact make longer-term investments. Now the interesting thing here is that the interest rate is sending a message about what types of investments I should make, and it also provides the incentive to make the right kind of investment. Here's where I would tend to get kind of nervous if the government gets too involved with setting interest rates, as that's going to mess up this signal and, in effect, lie to our entrepreneurs about what people actually want. Low interest rates would normally indicate people want things later on. You should undertake relatively slow productive processes that give us a really high value product at the end. Whereas high interest rates would indicate people want things right now, so you should undertake shorter production processes. Now here when we look at the second table, we find out that's in fact exactly what happens if interest rates are high. If interest rates are high, it ends up the present value of short-term investments are going to stand up better to the high interest rates than the long-term investments will. Now this shouldn't be particularly shocking, simply because the longer-term investment is going to put a higher value on the level of the interest rate. Right, so interest rates matter more for long-term investments simply because there's more time involved. Right, so what we can see here is what we could call capital switching. Right, if we have a low interest rate, then one investment is going to look more profitable than the other. Whereas if we have a high interest rate, the other investment looks more profitable. So which investment looks more profitable to us actually very much depends on interest rates, where there's going to be a general tendency that the lower interest rates are, the longer term investments are going to look more desirable. Whereas with high interest rates, short-term investments look more desirable. Now, a very important thing, because it's easy to get confused here, it's possible to get the impression that what entrepreneurs do is they go, well, okay, interest rates are up, let's just hurry. Right? Well, that's not what's going on. Instead, what's happening is that because interest rates are up, they adopt totally different processes, right? And perhaps produce totally different products that they can produce more quickly. Whereas if interest rates were lower, they tend to adopt different processes, produce different products where it takes somewhat more time, but would tend to create a higher overall value. So here, what we can show is that the length of the production process you choose is tied to the interest rate, which it ends up is a very nice thing, since the interest rate shows how important it is to society that we get things now or that we get things later, and it leads entrepreneurs in just the right direction, as long as we allow interest rates to communicate that signal. Another point worth making is the relationship between factor and product prices and the gap between them and the rate of interest. Right. Now it ends up that interest is connected to that gap between factor and product prices that we've seen before. Right. Right, just in the previous slide, we saw that with low interest rates, we're going to choose a very high value product even if it takes a while to get it. And when we look carefully, we find out that the product is worth $115, and there's going to be a tendency for us to be willing to pay up to $112.73 to start that process. Remember, the interest rate was 1%. It was a 2-year process. So here, the product and factor prices are actually very close together. There's just a little over $2 difference between them, between $2 and $3 difference. So there isn't really a whole lot of room here for what we might commonly call profit, but what really is just interest built into that production process. Whereas if interest rates are very high, remember first we're going to adopt a production process that's shorter but provides a lower valued product, say worth $110, and at the same time the amount we're paying for factors is far, far lower. In this case, $91.67. So with high interest rates, we tend to see a really big gap between factor and product prices. So it looks like in this case we have almost a $20 difference, something like $18.33. $18.33 is the difference between factor prices and the product price. So here we would expect there to be a very large of what we might normally would call profit, but here really all it is interest that's built into the production process. Right? After all, I'm buying up these factors. Time has to pass a good year before I can sell the product. It ends up that during that year, I gain enough money to, in effect, pay the interest rate. That's 20%. So we see then there is a relationship between interest rates and the gap between product and factor prices, where the higher the interest rate, the bigger the gap is going to be between these two different types of prices.